from the vast jungles of Canada to the hot soil of South Africa. The sparks of a trade war are flying everywhere. But this time the center is being rocked by tensions. Erupting on both sides of the Atlantic, the rivalry between the European Union and the United States has been on the agenda repeatedly over the past decades, but perhaps never in such harsh terms. On April 1, 2025, the President of the European Commission challenged the public in a loud voice. "We have a strong plan to retaliate against Trump tariffs." On the same day, the U.S. administration announced that the new tariffs would take effect, immediately further escalating tensions. So what is going on this time? And how do the parties plan to implement these hardening policy steps? The President of the European Commission statement on March 14, 2025, that our first retaliation envisages a volume of $28 billion, but if necessary, we can also implement a second phase of $108 billion, resonated widely on the continent. Following these words, the economy ministries of EU member states and representatives of the relevant sectors carried out intensive work on which products would be included in this list. In particular, the inclusion of strategic areas, such as automotive and pharmaceuticals, aims to disrupt the most important export revenues of the U.S. On April 1, 2025, the Washington administration further escalated tensions, with a statement saying, "There is no step back from the new tariffs. High taxes will be in effect as of April 2nd. The trend points to a period in which trade diplomacy is giving way to mutual accusations. Behind this escalation, transatlantic trade data shows an enormous magnitude. In 2023, trade in goods between the EU and the US amounted to about $1.1 trillion. Exports from the European side hovered around $550 billion, while the U.S. had an export performance of over $450 billion. The following year, in 2024, the picture grew and diversified a bit more. Economies that had recovered from the pandemic, albeit to a limited extent, were back on the offensive in many sectors, from aviation equipment to chemical products. In 2024, the European Union's exports to the United States will reach $575 billion, while U.S. exports to Europe will approach $470 billion. Thus, by the end of 2024, bilateral trade volume settled at 1.05 trillion tons. These data show how risky it is for two such interdependent blocs to engage in trade war rhetoric. However, Trump's second-term policies in particular have been frequently discussed under the heading of new protectionism. One reason for the first round of EU retaliation, launched in mid-March 2025, was the heavy U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum. European producers had long been selling to the U.S. market at competitive prices thanks to low tariffs. Giant plants in countries such as Germany, France, and Italy allocate a considerable share of their annual exports to these metals. According to statistics, by the end of 2024, the value of European steel and aluminum exports to the U.S. had reached around $40 billion. Brussels is therefore loudly proclaiming that if the American administration puts obstacles in the way of our steel and aluminum, we will respond with similar measures. Trade tensions between the European Union and the United States are heading towards one of the fiercest confrontations of the last few years. In fact, the fuse of this tension was lit by the U.S.'s insistence on reintroducing new tariffs, the so-called Trump tariffs. This debate, which had been going on out of the public eye for some time, reached its peak on April 1, 2025, when the White House announced, "We are announcing that the tariffs will take effect as of April 6." On the same day, the President of the European Commission signaled a counter-move by saying, "We have been prepared for a long time. We cannot accept unilateral impositions." These remarks were widely reported in the European media, with political commentators saying that the European Union has made it clear that it will not give in to Trump's second-term trade approach. For decades, transatlantic trade has been a key pillar of growth for both sides. From automobiles to aerospace equipment, from food to high-tech products, a huge network of exchanges has been built. But when Washington imposed tariffs of up to 25% on imported steel and aluminum, Europe reacted with outrage. Although there have been minor hiccups before, a move on this scale has brought the phrase trade war back to the agenda. We have seen many tensions throughout history, but this time we have different cards. The president of the European Commission said on April 1, 2025, indicating that Europe is preparing to turn its relatively high export volume into a major bargaining chip. Steel and aluminum exports are of great importance in Europe. In particular, leading producers such as Germany, France, and Italy employ hundreds of thousands of people in this sector. If the U.S. administration raises the tax wall, the profit margins of many European companies will shrink, and their supply chains will suffer. This has prompted the political will in Europe to quickly take countermeasures. The $28 billion in tariffs that Europe announced in the first phase are mainly in response to American steel, aluminum, and automotive products. On the other hand, the second phase of the $108 billion package could have a much broader impact. Beyond steel and aluminum, the fact that critical sectors such as automobiles, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, household appliances, and textiles are on the table is interpreted as retaliation in areas where interdependence is most clearly felt. The fact that automobile exports from Europe to the United States reached $70 billion in 2024 shows that this area is one of the biggest trump cards in the EU's hand. In particular, Germany's vehicle giants ship hundreds of thousands of cars and spare parts across the Atlantic every year. France and Italy also export considerable quantities of cars and luxury vehicles to the U.S. market, albeit to a lesser extent. If the EU wants to use these exports as a trump card, it could lead to sharp increases in the prices of European models, popular with American consumers. A similar escalation a few years ago was diffused by a concerted effort of industry lobby groups, but a similar compromise is unlikely. In the current political atmosphere, the pharmaceutical sector is also a potential target of phase 2 retaliation. Many countries in the European Union have significant shares of the global pharmaceutical market. Even though Germany is located next door to Switzerland, it conducts a very high volume of trade with the U.S. through giant pharmaceutical companies operating on its territory. France and Italy have a similar profile. In total, EU exports of pharmaceuticals and medical devices to the U.S. in 2024 are projected at over $60 billion. Therefore, an increase in tariffs on pharmaceuticals could push up costs across the board from American hospitals to pharmacies. This risk is an important pressure factor for Washington. On the other hand, giant American pharmaceutical companies need the low tariffs to continue exporting to the European market. It seems that this sector is at the heart of mutual interests. Semiconductors and technology components are also becoming a new front in the trade war. In fact, this area is not limited to Atlantic relations. China and other Asian countries also have a say in the semiconductor market, but Europe has critical semiconductor producers, notably the Netherlands and Germany. These manufacturers have proven their strength in high-tech components, exporting around $25 to $30 billion to the U.S. market in 2024. Possible additional tariffs from the U.S. could increase the prices of these components in the U.S. likewise. If the EU imposes additional tariffs on American semiconductor and digital technology products, it could hamper the competitiveness of Silicon Valley-based companies in the European market. In short, the phase 2 retaliation package is seen as a mechanism that could cause turmoil in the technology sector. More consumer-oriented sectors, such as home appliances and textiles, could also be a trump card for Brussels. In 2024, Europe shipped around $15 billion worth of textiles and apparel to the U.S. since many American brands also work closely with European manufacturers. Any disruptions in the supply chain would push up prices. In the home appliances market, many products from small kitchen appliances to white goods also make the transoceanic journey. As such a phase the tariffs are imposed, there could be volatility across the board, from consumers to giant importers. While those in Europe who currently support raising tariffs say, "We must respond to every obstacle the U.S. imposes on U.S." Some experts argue that getting too tough will hurt us too. Against this backdrop, the Trump administration's decision to introduce new tariffs on April 2, 2025 is seen as a turning point. This is because tensions have been expected to rise since the first round of retaliation in mid-March 2025, but it was not expected that at one punch would be thrown so quickly. The EU Commission's announcement on March 14, 2025, that we will not stop with the $28 billion package. We have a heavier set of measures worth $108 billion. Was echoed in the European media as a historic showdown. The U.S. administration, on the other hand, took the confrontation to another level, with its last statement on April 1, 2025, saying unless Europe steps back, tariffs will be imposed immediately. Thus, trade diplomacy almost reached an impasse. There are economic data on one side of this impasse, and strong messages to domestic public opinion on the other. The fact that the joint trade volume of Europe and the US is set to increase again and cross the $1 trillion threshold in 2024 proves how much the two countries need each other. Nevertheless, the fact that the leaders are putting up shields, especially in strategic sectors such as steel, aluminum, automobiles, and semiconductors, leads to the assessment that trade blows are being risked. In the short term, some commentators believe that these moves are a bargaining chip that will eventually bring the US and the EU to the table, and that both sides may eventually move towards a comprehensive trade deal. However, the harsh statements made in recent weeks have increased uncertainty in the markets and the business world. This uncertainty worries automotive industry stakeholders the most. While the European automotive industry was experiencing its heyday with exports to the US as of 2024, it now faces the risk of rising customs walls. In addition to Germany's giant brands, high-end vehicles produced in France, Italy, and Spain have long been in high demand on American roads. If the EU were to retaliate with a phased retaliation, we are imposing additional tariffs on cars and spare parts from the US. American brands could be hit hard in the European market. In fact, even though both Washington and Brussels have said the automotive sector is an unfavorable front, taking steps in this area will hurt everyone. No sector is safe at this point of tension. Pharmaceuticals and medical devices face a similar dilemma. As one of the world's leading drug manufacturers, the US generates millions of dollars in revenue from the European market, while European companies ship critical pharmaceutical and vaccine supplies to the US. If tariffs were to harden here too, the outlook could be difficult, not only economically, but also in terms of public health. But as long as the public is given the message, we will not back down in the leaders' statements, this possibility cannot be ruled out. Likewise, a trade barrier in the semiconductor and technology sectors could create a new bottleneck in the already troubled global chip supply at this point. Then the European Union is grappling with the question, how tough should it be against the American tariffs to be imposed on? April says, should we implement the $108 billion package immediately, or should we wait another month or two and take the chance for a compromise? Is the debate in Brussels. Lobbies export giants like Germany are in favor of leaving the door open to negotiation opportunities because they do not want to lose the US market completely. In France, on the other hand, there is a view that the steel and automotive sectors need to be protected first and foremost, so a tough EU stance would be more effective. Italy, Spain, and other members similarly make arguments in favor of their own sectors. In other words, the so-called common EU policy is actually shaped by a broad internal bargaining process. There is also an internal debate on the Washington front. Large retail chains and technology companies are calling on the White House to back down, saying a price increase on products from Europe would also put us in a difficult position. But the administration intends to present these protectionist moves, the so-called Trump tariffs, as a success to its voter base. Therefore, the line, "We will not give up until we get a result from the first round," seems to prevail as a result. The fact that this duel, which started in mid-March, will reach a whole new dimension on April 2, 2025, not only shakes the entire Atlantic economy, but also worries global markets. This is because Asian producers may try to strengthen their position as intermediate suppliers by taking advantage of the barriers imposed by the US and Europe. Given this picture, the question of course comes to mind, will they really go this far? There will be a last-minute sit-down at a truce agreement. Some trade experts say, however, the no turning back message from the President of the EU Commission on March 14, 2025, and the White House's tariffs will be imposed immediately. On April 1st, dim the light at the end of the tunnel for now, while politicians are trying to paint a picture of strong leadership. In their domestic public opinion, giant industrial and technology companies are warning, don't ignore diplomacy. But in an arena where trade ships are being loudly pulled, diplomacy is often pushed to the back burner, and more losses may be willing to be incurred to find a solution. In the European Union, the second phase of the proposed $108 billion package, if actually implemented, would cover not only huge sectors such as steel, aluminum, and automotive, but also many other strategic areas, from pharmaceuticals to semiconductors. This is a move that could have an earthquake effect on the foundations of the Atlantic economies. What do you think about these developments? Should the EU respond immediately to the American tariffs, which have been getting tougher since April 6th? Or should it be more cautious and sit down at the renegotiation table? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this podcast for instant information on similar topics. In the coming days, it will be clear how far the parties will go. Until then, we are all eagerly watching to see which move will prevail. In this contentious period of transatlantic trade, will Europe's second round of retaliation become a reality? Or will the door to diplomacy open and the trade wars end sooner rather than later? The world will now be watching for new statements from both sides of the Atlantic.